Yes, the spooky corner has become more spooky because it's officially fall, y'all! I'm so excited for it to be cold enough to wear hoodies, and for pumpkin spice everything, and for Halloween. I am so excited. But anyway, let's talk about trigger warnings. Hi, I'm Luna. Welcome to the Lunarium. Trigger warnings started being used on the internet about a decade ago, and in the time since have become a part of the culture wars. But what is a trigger warning? In order to define that, we need to define what a trigger is. According to BuzzFeed News, a trigger is something that elicits a symptomatic response in someone with a history of trauma, maybe flashbacks or a panic attack. Psychology Today defines a trigger as something that affects those who suffer from PTSD. It viscerally reminds them of a past experience and provokes an extreme and maladaptive negative emotional response. Triggers are unique to every person who has experienced trauma. Basically, the thing that is triggering for me may not be triggering for someone else with PTSD. It all depends on the experiences that caused the trauma. Sometimes triggers can seem really random. Some of my triggers are depictions of or discussion of suicide, people, especially men, yelling, red roses, and entire streets in the city where I live. When I am confronted with a trigger, it causes my PTSD to flare up. The exact degree to which my PTSD then affects me varies depending on the trigger or my general emotional state. But on the best possible case, when I encounter a trigger, it feels like an emotional punch to the gut. And I feel just like really cold and disturbed and scared, and it will cause me to feel intense sadness or fear for a little while. In the worst case, experiencing a trigger can cause me to have a panic attack or to dissociate, and that can prevent me from functioning normally for the rest of the day or sometimes even the next several days. Now let's talk about what a trigger is not. A trigger is not anything that causes you to feel irritated or unhappy. A trigger is not something trivial. Many of the people who argue against trigger warnings tend to talk about people wanting trigger warnings like they're fragile, that they are being too sensitive, they're snowflakes, that they are wanting to be protected from anything that could make them at all upset or unhappy. Such as this charming Atlantic article called The Coddling of the American Mind that shows a toddler in college and argues against using trigger warnings. In case it wasn't clear, this picture is insinuating that anyone who wants trigger warnings are wanting to be coddled and are essentially children. This Atlantic article talks about trigger warnings in a misinformed way. For example, because there is a broad ban in academic circles on blaming the victim, it is generally considered unacceptable to question the reasonableness, let alone the sincerity, of someone's emotional state, particularly if those emotions are linked to one's group identity. The thin argument, "I'm offended," becomes an unbeatable trump card. This passage reveals the fallacy and the very real bias of this article's author. Trigger warnings have nothing to do with being offended. Trigger warnings have to do with being traumatized. Most of the Atlantic article centers around the premise that calls for trigger warnings equate to calls for suppressing free speech. For example, the article says, in an article published last year by Inside Higher Ed, 7 humanities professors wrote that the trigger warning movement was already having a chilling effect on their teaching and pedagogy. When students come to expect trigger warnings for any material that makes them uncomfortable, the easiest way for faculty to stay out of trouble is to avoid material that might upset the most sensitive students in the class. Once again, there's this language of sensitive, uncomfortable, that completely discounts the reality of what a trigger actually is. This is also just a disingenuous argument. Students who want trigger warnings in college classes are not asking that material that triggers them be removed from a class or syllabus. They're not requesting that a teacher prevent discussing anything that might trigger any past trauma. They're asking for warnings. I'm going to go off of my own example once again because I feel like I can speak to that a lot. When I was 12, my mom committed suicide, and suicide since then has been a trigger. When I was a teenager and it was much closer to the event of my mom's suicide, literally just the word suicide caused me to enter a dissociative state. Of course, most of the books that you read in junior high and high school end with someone committing suicide. It's like an author's easy way to inject pathos into any book. For me, I know I should have come to expect it, but I never did. And that gut punch of you're reading something and then all of a sudden there's this often really close depiction of someone attempting or completing suicide was just so difficult. It was so difficult for me to read the material, to have that material discussed in class. It's that gotcha that is really what causes the most harm. Many of the books that are assigned in high school, at least in my high school, are assigned because they are mandated reading by the state or because they are expected to be covered on the SATs. So even though at the time I wanted to not have to read those things, it wouldn't have benefited me if a teacher had said, okay, I know that you have gone through a traumatic event, you shouldn't have to read about anything that depicts suicide. What would have helped me is a warning. In chapter whatever, suicide will appear. It wouldn't have changed how hard it is for me to read about suicide, but would have given me warning so that gotcha doesn't happen, so that the way that trauma takes over doesn't take me by surprise. Trigger warnings can be really helpful in college because people who have identified triggers, if they know when they start a class, let's say a professor includes trigger warnings in their syllabus, and they're able to see, okay, in week 5 of this semester, we're going to be reading Mrs. Dalloway, and Mrs. Dalloway includes a trigger warning for suicide. I now know that around week 5, I can expect to be covering material that will bring up trauma for me. That means I can work my schedule around to make sure that I've completed all of the other coursework that I possibly can before that week to try to limit how much is on my plate during the time that traumatic thing is being discussed. It's not about I'm going to not read that material or skip class that week. It's about I'm going to do everything that I can to make sure that I can handle having that material that provokes a trauma response need to be covered in my class. The Atlantic article continues and lists all of these imagined dangers that they think trigger warnings are going to cause, such as not preparing college students for the real world. The author of the article also says that trigger warnings aren't even helpful for people with PTSD. He writes, according to the most basic tenets of psychology, the very idea of helping people with anxiety disorders avoid the things they fear is misguided. A person who is trapped in an elevator during a power outage may panic and think she is going to die. That frightening experience can change neural connections in her amygdala, leading to an elevator phobia. If you want this woman to retain her fear for life, you should help her avoid elevators. But if you want to help her return to normalcy, you should take your cues from Ivan Pavlov and guide her through a process known as exposure therapy. Classroom discussions are safe places to be exposed to incidental reminders of trauma, such as the word violate. A discussion of violence is unlikely to be followed by actual violence, so it is a good way to help students change the associations that are causing them discomfort. And they'd better get their habituation done in college, because the world beyond college will be far less willing to accommodate requests for trigger warnings and opt-outs. Disregarding, once again, that the author is talking about opt-outs as if that has anything to do with a desire for trigger warnings, this argument has some merit. I now am much more comfortable with depictions and discussions of suicide. I didn't read Mrs. Dalloway in high school. I read Mrs. Dalloway in my senior year of college. My professor did not include trigger warnings, and that suicide scene was a gut punch. It was a gotcha. And I was very upset by it, but it didn't cause me to cease functioning for a while. It was upsetting and I moved on. And that did occur because of many years of exposure to suicide, not to mention my own suffering from suicidal ideation. But this idea that people with PTSD should learn from Ivan Pavlov, you know, the guy famous for training dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell, which I would argue is not a very flattering depiction of people with PTSD, that you should train them out of their trauma responses, is just... People experiencing PTSD need to go through their own journeys. Yeah, they should be seeing a therapist. Yeah, they should be getting help. And that therapist should be the one who decides how that person is going to come to terms with their trauma. It isn't the job of a college professor to try to desensitize people to their triggers. That's absurd. Also, legitimately, I think that people don't understand how devastating it is when a trigger can happen, how it's not about being upset, it's about feeling like you are about to die. Sorry, I get really worked up about this. I don't understand why it's so difficult to just have warnings. That's all it is. It's just asking for people to list warnings. Outside of college classes, trigger warnings can help people decide whether or not they want to participate or engage with content. Posts online, shows, anything like that. If someone is at a place with their trauma where any exposure to a trigger can cause them to completely destabilize and lose the ability to go about their daily life, they shouldn't have to watch certain episodes, read certain things on posts. It doesn't matter. It's not like a college class. That is when people are asking for opt-outs. Basically, I need a warning so that I can choose not to engage with this material, or so that I can be prepared that the material will include things that could trigger me. But again, trigger warnings come down to choice. They come down to respecting that people with PTSD are not like dogs They are people who should get to decide when they want to take on the journey of learning to desensitize, of seeking help with their trauma and moving on with their life. I'd like to bring up an example of how you can incorporate trigger warnings and not have it be a big deal. The comedian Curtis Connor, in one of his most recent YouTube videos, used trigger warnings really effortlessly.
Big trigger warning here for sexual assault, but I'm going to show you one of his old jokes that he was super proud of. I can only find a duet of the original video because, you know, guy got banned. Can't relate. But the duet is from this guy named Tom Gray. He's very funny. But yeah, skip to this part if you don't want to see this TikTok, okay? But it's going to play in 3, 2, 1.
It wasn't a big deal. It didn't ruin the flow of his video. He just said, this triggering content is coming. If you don't want to see it, jump to this timestamp. And that's it. That's all it takes. And finally, I wanted to end this video with just a really quick discussion of using the word triggered in the first place. I truly believe that one of the reasons why so many people don't understand what trigger warnings are for is because people misuse the word triggered. I see a lot of people online, and even people I interact with face-to-face, using triggered as a substitution for the word annoyed or bothered. I know that there are some people out there who are going to continue to deliberately misunderstand what trigger warnings are for, because as we've seen with mask wearing, there is a portion of humans who just don't want to be told what to do, who just don't want to have to change their behavior in any way, even if it could help other people. But I have to believe that most people aren't like that. That most people, if they would just understand the harm that their actions could cause to others, would choose to do the considerate thing. So if I can, I would like to request for anyone watching this who uses the word triggered when what they mean is upset or bothered, to please use the word upset or bothered and leave triggered for people who actually experience being triggered. So to sum up, a trigger is an external stimulus that can cause someone with PTSD or who has experienced trauma to feel as if they are reliving that trauma. Trigger warnings are not intended to silence people. They are meant to try to prepare people who have experienced trauma that they are about to be exposed to a trigger. And then that person can make a decision about whether they are ready to be exposed to that trigger or not. And also, using trigger when you don't actually mean trigger in a trauma sense helps perpetuate the spread of the idea that people want trigger warnings just to avoid being upset or offended. Sorry that this video was pretty rambly and ranty, although who am I kidding? I guess most of my videos are rambly and ranty. This is something that affects me personally and that I get pretty fired up about. I hope all of you are doing as well as can be expected. Please take care of yourselves. Until next time, bye.